Hi everyone, welcome back to APUSH History. We are now back in our digital mode, so we're going to pick up where we left off on Tuesday with our southern colonies. In this PowerPoint, you will see a quick review of what we did on Tuesday for those of you that were out, but we're going to focus on the Carolinas, Georgia, and wrapping up the southern colonies. There will be another PowerPoint presentation that focuses on New England and then the middle colonies. Remember, we talked about how we really want to take a look at our learning objectives. They will help us prepare our content, but also give us an idea of the really important lessons for each time period. So these two learning objectives, one of them is asking us to be able to explain the context for colonization of North America, and that's looking at all four of the major European powers, and then to be able to explain how and why various European colonies developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. We talked the other day on Monday, we looked at this map and we compared these four countries, where they settled, how they interacted with American Indians, how they made money, the role of religion, and really what was driving their colonization. So taking a look at our regions, our learning objectives would ask us to explain how and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of various British colonies. So we already know that geography is going to be pretty important. And then also explain how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians have changed over time. A map as a good little reminder. In the coming days, we will talk about our purple colonies up here that we call New England. These yellow colonies we will call the middle colonies, and the green and the blue are the southern colonies. Remember, the green colonies are also called the Chesapeake colonies as well, and you must be able to distinguish that. Today we're going to focus on the blue colonies. There's a list of your colonies. Jamestown, for those of you who are out, we went over this on Tuesday, but these are the key ideas of what's going on in Jamestown. Remember that Jamestown is a rather small settlement, and ultimately we will look at all of colonial Virginia when we talk about tobacco, indentured servants, slavery, the political systems at work, and the conflicts that they have with American Indians. We also talked about Maryland, and I pointed out there's really four important things. Tobacco will be the key component of their economy. They are the second part of the Chesapeake Bay colonies. They were initially created as a safe haven for Catholics. As the number of Protestants increased in Maryland, the Catholics started to worry that they might not be able to practice their faith safely. So we see the passage of the Act of Toleration in 1649, which ultimately is going to allow all Christians to practice their faith freely. Remember, let's not look at this on 2020 standards, because that really wouldn't be all that tolerant. But in the 1600s and throughout Europe, we know that for the last the last 100 years, the Christians have been divided between the Catholics and the Protestants, and there have been lots of wars. And so this was pretty impressive for the colonies to go ahead and do this. So then that takes us to the Carolinas. And in case you didn't know, this actually used to be just one big colony, as your map is illustrating. Over time, what's going to happen is that they will divide into two separate colonies. We know this today because we have a South Carolina and North Carolina. And I want to focus the bulk of our time talking about South Carolina because it will be more populated and wealthier than North Carolina. This will develop in the second half of the 1600s, and South Carolina will ultimately see pretty quick growth. There are a lot of migrants that are coming to South Carolina, and many of them are coming from the Caribbean. They're planters currently on British-held islands, and they're moving to the coast of South Carolina to settle. Remember, we are in a very southern part of the country, and so we've got very mild winters and hot, long summers, which are perfect growing seasons for agriculture. South Carolina is going to be really unique here. They're going to focus heavily on rice and indigo. That's right, rice and indigo. Seems kind of odd, but that's what they're going to focus on. It's real easy to think that cotton was a huge crop in colonial America, and I want you to kind of tell yourself over and over again, no cotton in the colonies. That's not entirely true. Cotton did exist, but it was very time and labor intensive, and so it wasn't commonly found. But cotton gin's not invented till the 1790s, so we have a little while before cotton really starts to become a key part of the southern economy. So you need to remember rice and tobacco. Agriculture was a huge part of South Carolina's economy, and Charleston becomes a major hub for trade in South Carolina. For a little bit, the settlers in South Carolina will experiment with enslaving American Indians. Ultimately, tribes would fight one another and they would sell prisoners of war as slaves to the British colonists, and ends up causing some problems, so it's outlawed. So it's very short term, but if you ever saw a reference to it, that's what that's referring to. The other big thing that I want to point out about South Carolina, we mentioned the other day in Virginia that the growth of African slavery was relatively slow. In Virginia and Maryland, there was a heavy focus and emphasis on indentured servants, and by the late 1600s, that had kind of switched, and we started to see more of an emphasis on using slaves from Africa. Well, in South Carolina, that's almost an instant. Many of these planters coming from the Caribbean are experienced with using African slaves, and they bring that system with them. So the economy of South Carolina will be heavily reliant on African labor. Eventually, Virginia and Maryland will be as well, but South Carolina, that's a pretty important thing to their economy right away, and it's really key to the success of those crops in South Carolina. Not that it's right, we will talk about that in the coming days, but it's not a gradual growth. That's kind of the big difference here. Now, North Carolina is going to develop slightly differently. Many of the migrants that come to North Carolina are actually going to be people coming from Virginia that are moving south. In South Carolina, a lot of the settlement is along the coast. But in North Carolina, a lot of the settlement is kind of in central North Carolina. This coast of North Carolina was very difficult to navigate. Sometimes it was referred to as the graveyard of the Atlantic. So you're going to see that most of the settlement for North Carolina will be in the center part of the state. These settlers are very independent. They're very suspicious of big government and of the wealthy elites that had controlled power in Virginia and will down the road in North Carolina, but they will also bring tobacco with them. So you must know that Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina are your tobacco colonies. That's really important that you know that. Okay? And then last but not least, this takes us to Georgia. And, we like to think that we'll spend a lot of time talking about Georgia since it's where we live, but in all honesty, of the 13 colonies, it's a baby. It's created in the 1730s, much later than our other colonies. It's very small, and the key purpose is really to protect South Carolina. South Carolina was a wealthy and important part of the British system, and if you remember, the Spanish are in Florida. And so they want Georgia to really be a buffer state to protect South Carolina. Over time, Savannah will develop as a trading port, and many of the settlers will copy the economy of South Carolina, although the founder, James Oglethorpe, had initially wanted to ban slavery. It does not last in the long run. So wrapping up this lesson on the southern colonies, we need to know that the economy is largely agriculturally based. There is some trade. We see Charleston, Savannah. There will eventually be a thriving trade throughout the Chesapeake Bay, but this is a region that is primarily dependent on agriculture. We know early on indentured servants provide the majority of the labor, and over time, African slaves will dominate that role and end up making these colonies very wealthy. We don't see a huge discussion on the morality of slavery in colonial America. We will see on another presentation a couple of groups that question whether or not that it is right, but we're not quite there yet in our history. So just kind of keep that in mind. Remember, as I said, the economics, that this is a largely agricultural based area. They had long growing seasons, and they developed these plantation based economies that are based on exporting staple crops, which were things in hot demand such as tobacco. In addition, the South is largely rural. We don't see a lot of towns. We don't see, in the North, we'll see Boston and Philadelphia and New York City. In the South, people are spread out. They're a little bit more disconnected. There's not as much of feeling of community as we will see in our New England colonies. And so over time, the Southern colonists will start to develop their own culture. Most of the people living in the Southern colonies are English, are the forced labor from Africa. We will see a couple of immigrant groups, which we'll talk about later. And one new thing that we haven't talked too much, most of our Southern colonists are members of the Anglican Church. Henry VIII, when he broke away from the Catholic Church to get divorced, he created the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church. So many of the settlers in your southern colonies were members of the Anglican Church. Obviously, we know some exceptions. You've got your Catholic population in Maryland. Charleston and Savannah actually had some religious diversity. They were fairly tolerant of other groups, but the vast majority of your settlers are English and Anglican. Now, there are lots of areas where your slave population dominates your English population. They greatly outnumber them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in our slavery lesson, but those are the largest groups. Your middle colonies are way more diverse than anywhere else. Let me know if you have any questions. That's our wrap up on the Southern colonies.